The land that Disney couldn't buy. In 1967, the Walt Disney Company purchased 27,400 acres of undeveloped land in the Central Florida area. This was the largest land acquisition by a private company that had ever occurred, and it was wildly successful. This land made Walt Disney World and the entire Florida project possible. But there was one problem. There was one piece of land located right adjacent to Interstate 4 that Disney was not able to purchase because the landowner would not sell. And to this day, not only does Disney not own this property, but a separate private company has actually developed it. This is the story of Bonnet Creek. Welcome back to our channel. It is 2026. This is my first video of the year, and despite a new year, it is still the same me. I am still covering the early days of Walt Disney World because, guys, there's a lot to talk about. Today's topic was actually submitted by a viewer. It is the story of Bonnet Creek, this piece of land that Disney was never able to obtain despite many years of trying. It's really kind of like an up moment, if you will. And so that is what we are going to dive into today. To truly understand this story, we need to do a very quick overview about what Walt Disney World is today. I know most of us have been to Disney World, but there's a few things that you just might not have needed to pay attention to, like the fact that Walt Disney World is located in two counties, Orange County and Osceola County, and that county line runs east-west across Walt Disney World property. A couple of other things of note: Interstate 4 runs on the eastern edge of the Walt Disney World property and actually cuts through a portion of it. US 192 runs east-west, slicing the Walt Disney World property through the middle. And then there's a couple of kind of iconic lakes and streams on Disney property that will be very important to the context of this story. Bay Lake, that's a big one. You know that one by Fort Wilderness and Wilderness Lodge and even part of Contemporary. It's not the Seven Seas Lagoon, but it's the lake located right next to that. And the last piece of land we'll talk about is Lake Bryan. Lake Bryan is a lake that Disney does not own. All of these things will really help ground our story. But now let's dive into the actual origins, which is going to take us to around the turn of the century, right before the year 1900. I pulled an old 1890 atlas to see the land that Disney would one day buy. And so on this land, we see Bay Lake, which eventually Magic Kingdom would be built next to. Running north-south, we see the Reedy Creek, which is on the west side of Disney property. Sort of in the center of the property, running north-south as well, we see the Bonnet Creek, which runs through the Fort Wilderness Campground all the way down to the southern end of Disney. And the last thing I'll point out, which again Disney does not own, but that is Lake Bryan. This is going to be a really easy landmark to see on most of the maps. So that's our 1890 atlas. And if you can't tell, there's not a lot going on in this area. It is almost completely undeveloped.
A few years ago, if a fed-up city dweller were looking for a place to get away from the rat race, he might have taken a wistful look at Orange County, Florida. He could sail slowly through the unspoiled wilderness of its inland waters and not have to see a soul all day. Ranch country, orange groves, cheap living, ideal weather. And best of all, it hadn't really caught on the way the beach resorts and retirement towns had.
A large portion of the land was owned by cattle ranchers, specifically in the northern portion of the land that Disney now owns. That land was owned by the Bronson family, who was a huge cattle rancher at the time, and they occupied a lot of the property. There was also a portion of land that was not owned by a single owner, and that was because it was purchased by the Munger subdivision. This is incredibly important. In 1912, the Munger Land Company began selling subdivided 5-acre lots through a mail order operation. Literally, advertisements in the mail and newspapers where people could buy a piece of property sight unseen. This piece of property was completely undeveloped. There were no roads, there was no electricity, there were certainly not any homes there. Some of the properties were swampland, some of them could have been usable if they hypothetically ever were built on. And to be honest, people were trusting an advertisement. They really just didn't have much information about this land. But all across the United States and even in Europe, people bought these lots. But despite hundreds of new property owners, every single lot remained completely empty and undeveloped. Years pass and the property still remains undeveloped. And to be clear, this property couldn't have even really been visited if they wanted to. It was not actually marked out in the open. Sure, it was on a map, but you wouldn't be able to find your specific acreage. You couldn't drive there because there were no roads. It would be really challenging. So in some ways, these people made kind of a bad investment. In others, maybe not so much. So eventually, after many quiet years of these properties being owned, suddenly there were some whispers. There were whispers about the area of Florida becoming a much greater attraction. And in many ways, this is thanks to Interstate 4. If you want to learn more about that, you can go watch my deep dive on Disney roads. And so in 1962, something finally happens. An investor rolled up looking to buy some of the land of the Munger subdivision, specifically this area here. And while this was a rather quiet sale, because really, why would anyone care when there was truly nothing going on at this time, a large portion of land was purchased. Oh, sorry. Also, this isn't Disney. This investor was not Walt Disney, who was about to come to Florida. This was someone else. That someone else is named Ling Kai-kung, a resident of Taiwan. And why exactly did he buy this parcel of land? Well, according to an article from Orlando Sentinel in the year 2000, it was said that it was likely an investment potentially for the shipping and space industries. So now the year is 1963, and Walt and his team have determined that Florida is the optimal location for an East Coast Disneyland. And so in November, Walt, his daughter Sharon, his son-in-law Bob Brown, and a team of executives hop on a company plane to tour the area. And as the story goes, Walt saw Riles Island and Bay Lake outside his window and said, "This is it. This is my Tom Sawyer's Island and the land that would become the Florida Project." This isn't exactly how it went, but this is the story that Disney really tells to say how Walt selected this land. Anyhow, after the visit, Walt tasked Robert Price Foster, known as Bob Foster, not to be confused with Walt's son-in-law Bob Brown, to buy a lot of land in Central Florida. But of course, they had to keep this really under wraps because they didn't want anyone to know that Disney was about to buy a huge piece of land. You know, Disneyland had been open for about 10 years. It was wildly successful. So if people heard that Disney was coming to Florida, those prices would hike up. And so Disney had to do this really under the radar. And so basically, Disney kept this on a need-to-know basis. They put together a full land acquisition plan, and they created 5 shell companies that could buy the land without drawing attention. Those companies were incorporated around the year 1964, and they were named Tomahawk Properties, I-4 Corporation, the Latin American Development and Management Corporation, the Reedy Creek Ranch, Inc., which is also occasionally referred to as the Rocky Creek Ranch, Inc., in case you ever read an article that mentions that, Bay Lake Properties, Inc., and eventually the overarching Compass East Corporation, which was created that consolidated all of these shell companies. And so these shell companies began purchasing the land for Disney. Again, under the radar. There were a couple of pretty critical land acquisitions that occurred. On April 26th of 1965, the Latin American Development and Management Corporation purchased nearly 9,000 acres that were owned by the Bronson family, that same cattle rancher family, at a price of about $100 an acre for a total price of $866,666. Another parcel was sold in June of 1965, which was 12,400 acres, to the Reedy Creek Ranch Incorporation at a price of $1.6 million and about $130 an acre. Those were really kind of the easy ones. I'm not going to say they were actually easy. Disney had to jump through a bunch of hoops to make this possible, but they were easier than what Disney was about to face. Because remember, the Munger subdivision, all of those people scattered all across the United States who owned a piece of land that they had purchased around the year 1912. They had never done anything with it, they likely didn't know much about it, and it's highly likely that a lot of the property had already been passed down to a son or a daughter. And so Disney now had to figure out, how can we buy all of these tiny little parcels of land? And so did they do it? Well, yes, actually they did. There's a really interesting article on the D23 website that talks all about this process. Disney contacted almost every single owner. They sent at times 10s and 20, 30 letters back and forth. They visited properties all across the USA, California, Texas, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and more. Many of the owners had never seen their plot of land. They had never even potentially been to Florida. And after all of this hard work, the Disney company was successful. They did acquire a lot of this land, except this portion of land that's located on the Orange County and Osceola County line. It's right on Interstate 4. It is in many ways prime real estate, and it was owned by 2 parties, Lin Kai-kung and Wai Ying Ki, those 2 people who had purchased the land around 1962. And a 1966 Tampa Bay Times article said that it was land that Disney no doubt wanted. If you look at a map, it's literally a pocket of land that was missing then and is missing now from Disney property. So, Why did these two individuals not sell? Well, it's possible that they felt like this land would be developed very shortly for something like the space industry, and so maybe they were planning something greater. But no, not quite. It's possible that Disney was unable to reach them or they did not respond. It's never been documented if that was the case. But regardless, Disney was unable to purchase the land. And eventually, the secret came out. The Orlando Sentinel published that famous article, "We say the mystery industry is Disney." Suddenly, all of the land prices were hiked up astronomically, and the Disney company said, "We're good. We're not going to be purchasing too much land at that crazy price, other than maybe a couple of key critical lots." But that lot right there, Disney had to let go. And so Disney began developing their land. They started with the Magic Kingdom and the nearby resorts and the Vacation Kingdom, and then the Lake Buena Vista community and Epcot. And as they were building these things, the nearby area was flourishing as well. New resorts were popping up on International Drive. An expanded airport was built. But the Ling property remained undeveloped. Next, MGM Studios is built, the Grand Floridian Caribbean Beach Resort. Still, the Ling property remains undeveloped. Then, almost exactly 30 years after that parcel of land had been purchased, something finally happens. In 1992, Ling Kai-kung passes away, and his son Gregory takes over his estate. And finally, after that 30 years of ownership, the property begins to see a few waves of development. But there are kind of some problems because Disney owns all of the land surrounding this parcel. Disney has developed this land surrounding the parcel. They have roads. They have their own government system. They have sewage. They have everything. And this parcel of land is unconnected to everything. It has nothing. And so they need to figure out how these two pieces of land, Disney's and Ling's land, can possibly coexist. And so in 1993, the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which again is basically Disney's, local government agency, and representatives from World Union Cayman Limited, based in Hong Kong, and this is the same company that was, related to Ling Kai-kung, they created an interlocal and development agreement to work out issues just like I mentioned: road access, development on adjacent parcels, stormwater management, conservation, and more. Shortly after they developed that, the World Union Cayman Limited Company filed an application for development approval of a DRI, a Development of Regional Impact. And what they proposed for this piece of land was to develop 3,000 hotel units, a 250,000 square foot conference center, 1,635 timeshare units, and a 50,000 square foot gross leasable area of general retail structures. In 2000, the Orlando-based Brooksville Development Corporation became the developer for this area, and a master plan was created with an 18-hole golf course and multiple high-end hotels. And so from the agreement that was made with the Reedy Creek Improvement District, they basically granted access to their roads, but there would only be one entrance in and one exit out. And so a driveway approach was added to Disney's Buena Vista Drive. And finally, after 40 years of undevelopment, a new resort popped up. It was the Fairfield Orlando, and it opened in June of 2004. And just for reference, it later became the Wyndham Bonnet Creek. But that was it for a bit. Roads were built, but they just dead-ended. A rough outline of an 18-hole golf course was laid out, but it was never actually completed. Finally, in 2006, Hilton came on board, and they had plans to build 2 hotels, the Hilton Hotel and the Waldorf Astoria, as well as a conference center. And those opened up in 2009 with a golf course. Still, the property on the other side of Bonnet Creek remained undeveloped. There was a bridge, and it led to nowhere. It wouldn't be until 2020 that the JW Marriott finally opened up in this location. And today, if we look at this property, there is only one spot slated for expansion next to the JW Marriott. Now, the question you might be asking yourself, this is located so close to Disney property. You have to actually be on Disney property and enter through those big Disney gates to get there. Do they get any on-site type perks? No, they do not. Sure, they get to, have access, I suppose, through Disney's property, but they don't get any on-site perks if you stay at those hotels. You don't get to take a Disney bus. You don't have actual cast members working at that hotel. They are completely private entities that just happen to be located right next to Disney. There's another thing that when I did a lot of research for this video, People really think that this is actually on Disney's land, that they somehow have this land leased out, like they do over by Disney Springs. But again, that is not the case. Other than the fact that they share the roads and Disney maintains the intersection and things, Disney has basically nothing to do with this land. I mean, would they have liked to? Yes. But no, they have nothing to do with it. Caribbean Beach and the resorts at this area are probably 10, 20 feet away, but there's no access through them. There's no path. There's nothing because, again, Disney has nothing to do with this land. If Disney had purchased this land, would things have really changed? Honestly, not really. Disney has several interstate exits that already come from I-4 and connect to their property, which is a story for another day. I know we talked on roads, but there's a whole added layer to that. Disney has a huge portion of property that's still undeveloped. So all this would really be giving them was just a little bit more property to have. And at the end of the day, it worked out okay for them. And so that is the story of Bonnet Creek. Thank you so much to the viewer who submitted this topic. This was such an interesting one to cover. And I will be back in 2 weeks with a great video that might dive into a little bit more civil engineering type things. So I'll see you all soon. And thanks for tuning in the new year. Bye.